Good morning, everybody. I welcome everybody who came here, for those who are following us online. And we start with the presentation of the 21st quarterly report of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. And it would be presented by Ms. Fiona Frazer, the head of the monitoring mission to Ukraine. So you are welcome.
Good morning to you all. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the launch of the 21st quarterly report of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine that covers the period from the 16th of November 2017 to the 15th of February 2018. This month marks the 4th year after the arrival of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Our mandate remains steadfast: to support the government in ensuring better human rights protection for people across the whole of the country. Yet, 4 years on, we document the same human rights violations which we reported prior to the conflict: arbitrary and prolonged detention, use of torture and ill treatment, limited access to due process and effective remedy. All of these within a system that lacks accountability, maintains impunity for perpetrators of crimes, and provides limited justice for victims. These systemic human rights issues have been further exacerbated by the conflict. Victims of human rights violations and abuses are calling for justice and peace. We need solid determination and resolve from all the parties to end the armed hostilities. We also need perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses to be brought to account. And we need the government to introduce policies that foster social cohesion in Ukraine. As we enter the 5th year of the armed conflict, hostilities continue to devastate families, taking human lives and causing physical and psychological trauma, and destroying property and damaging critical civilian infrastructure. Between the 16th of November 2017 and the 15th of February 2018, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission documented a total of 73 conflict-related civilian casualties. 12 people were killed and 61 injured. While this is an overall decrease of 16% compared with the previous reporting period, the number of civilian casualties resulting from shelling and light weapons fire actually increased during this period by 66.7%, indicating that the armed hostilities continue to pose a serious threat to the population. What we did note is that following a spike in civilian casualties in December, there was a substantial reduction in the number of civilian casualties recorded in January and February. In fact, there were no civilian deaths recorded in February and only 7 civilian injuries as a result of the conflict. This is the lowest number of monthly civilian casualties we recorded during the entire conflict period. Although there have been 3 civilian deaths and 7 civilian injuries in March, the trend of low civilian casualties currently continues. Shelling of essential civilian infrastructure continued during the reporting period, putting civilian lives at great risk. Damages to key water and electricity infrastructure and delays in negotiating windows of silence for repairs and maintenance have repeatedly disrupted the supply of water and electricity to conflict-affected areas. In particular, the Donetsk filtration station, which supplies water for 345,000 people on both sides of the contact line, comes under fire more than any other infrastructure. It was shelled on 8 occasions over the reporting period, with potentially devastating consequences for the population and the environment, given the toxic chlorine gas stored in that facility. In addition, only within a couple of days last week, staff of this facility were shot at repeatedly on their way to work. It is clear that respect for the ceasefire is highly effective in protecting civilians and civilian infrastructure. We have seen a significant reductions in hostilities since the 5th of March recommitment to the ceasefire. Thus, more must be done to ensure that political will does not wane on both sides of the contact line and that the ceasefire is sustainable. We therefore reiterate our call on all the parties to the conflict to strictly adhere to the ceasefire and to implement all other commitments in the Minsk agreements, including the withdrawal of heavy weapons and the disengagement of forces and hardware. On the 27th of December 2017, a simultaneous release of 307 individuals took place under the auspices of the all-for-all release envisioned under the Minsk agreements. Through confidential interviews on both sides of the contact line with 64 of those released individuals, we collected substantial information on detention conditions and human rights violations and abuses. All of those interviewed reported inhumane conditions of detention, torture, oral treatment, including instances of sexual violence, threats of violence, and/or violations of fair trial guarantees. In particular, we were able to shed some light on the situation for those people who are detained in territory controlled by armed groups, where we continue to be denied access to detention facilities and to meet privately with detainees. The testimonies collected by these interviews, as well as an additional 113 confidential interviews with persons held in various detention facilities in government-controlled territory, confirm what we have been consistently reporting. Moreover, in these past 3 months, we have documented 121 cases of credible allegations of arbitrary detention, torture, ill treatment and sexual violence committed on both sides of the contact line. Over the course of the 4 years of work conducted by the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, we have established that the use and practice of torture is unfortunately rooted in the system. We are working with state authorities and partners on long-term sustainable solutions which will enable proper documentation of allegations of torture, provide an environment where victims can be heard and their claims recognized, and ensure that perpetrators are held responsible for their crimes. Torture must stop. There is no excuse, no justification for it. Neither should it be tolerated, ever.
Thank you, Ms. Frazer.
4 years on from the Maidan protests in Kiev, we still do not see sufficient progress in bringing to accountability those responsible for the killings and violence, although we are aware of the efforts made by the Prosecutor General's office in these complex cases. The same holds true for the tragic events during the 2nd of May 2014 violence in Odessa. The families of those killed during these protests deserve justice. It is a key component of combating the climate of impunity. Through trial monitoring and interviews, we have observed undue pressure and intimidation of judges from law enforcement and right-wing groups, as well as unknown persons. In Kharkiv in particular, we are deeply concerned about repeated and ongoing threats against the judges hearing the retrial of Nyelestepa, former mayor of Slovansk. We are further concerned about retaliatory measures taken by prosecution offices, for example, with criminal cases registered against judges as punishment or intimidation for using a decision with which law enforcement disagrees. Such actions are not only an attack on the individual judges, but also constitute a serious assault on the independence of the judiciary as a whole. In territory controlled by armed groups, residents have no access to justice. They cannot access the Ukrainian court system. So-called trials held in conflict-related cases are carried out in closed sessions, and we have found that in these proceedings, accused persons lack effective legal representation and stand trial with no real chance of presenting a defense. With the 2019 elections and respective campaigning in sight, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission is paying careful attention to human rights issues which flout the notions of constitutional democracy and inclusiveness. Physical attacks and use of force against journalists and media professionals by members of right-wing groups and state actors were documented during the reporting period. These restricted the freedom of expression and opinion. Likewise, unchecked physical aggression of extreme right-wing groups who attacked and injured individuals belonging to minority groups or those holding alternative social and political opinions and disrupted public gatherings and social events posed a significant threat to the rule of law and to the fabric of society. Actions which result in intolerance and hate crimes must be addressed through prompt and effective investigations and clear public condemnation. 600,000 people residing in settlements close to the contact line continue to face daily hardship due to the conflict. In addition to the security risks they face, these people lack access to healthcare, emergency and other essential services within the context of a declining socio-economic situation. In addition, continuing restrictions on their movement across the contact line and within their own villages and on their efforts to access public services further isolates these communities. At the same time, we observe no progress in establishing an accessible and effective restitution and compensation mechanism for property damaged or destroyed by the armed hostilities. This leaves people, often coming from the most affected communities, financially disadvantaged, lacking shelter, and feeling abandoned by the government. The situation is further compounded by government policies and legislation, as well as practices imposed by the self-proclaimed republics, which serve to alienate Ukrainians across the artificial contact line. The recent prohibition imposed on persons considered civil servants by the so-called authorities of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic on traveling to government-controlled territory illustrates this worrying pattern. We continue to call on the government to de-link access to pensions from IDP registration, and we welcome the recent Supreme Court decisions which invalidated the termination of pension payments in individual cases which had been based on Cabinet of Ministers Resolution number 365. We need to encourage the creation of building blocks for social cohesion, peace and reconciliation, and not those that divide. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission continued to monitor, document, and report on the human rights situation in Crimea from mainland Ukraine on the basis of the UN General Assembly resolutions on the territorial integrity of Ukraine and the status of Crimea as under temporary occupation by the Russian Federation. Since 2014, we have reported on systemic problems undermining human rights protection, lack of impartiality in the administration of justice, restrictions on the exercise of fundamental freedoms, including peaceful protests, lack of accountability for human rights violations, and underpinning it all, the unwillingness of the Russian Federation authorities to allow critical and dissenting views. We continue to document that these human rights violations and infringements on fundamental freedoms disproportionately affect the Crimean Tatar community. The Russian Federation, as the occupying power, has obligations under international law. It continues to violate international law by applying its own legal framework on the peninsula and by forcibly recruiting Crimean residents into its armed forces. In addition, over the past 4 years, we have noted a drastic decline by 97% in the number of students in public schools receiving education in their native Ukrainian language. One of the most significant legislative developments during the reporting period was the adoption of a law providing a new framework for re-establishing control over certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The law defines those areas as occupied by the Russian Federation and attempts to attribute responsibility for ensuring the rights of residents in the territory to the Russian Federation as the occupying power. We welcome the fact that the law affirms the government's positive obligations in relation to the population residing in this territory and cites commitments regarding the protection of fundamental, civil and political rights, the satisfaction of economic, social and cultural rights, humanitarian needs, and the restoration of property rights. We call on the government to follow through with these commitments and put human rights protection at the core of any bylaws and implementation of this law. This is essential for fostering an environment conducive to peace and reconciliation. As winter begins to give way to spring, we are at a time of change, and it is indeed time for change. The opportunity for progress and improvement in the human rights situation is present. Ceasefire violations are down. Civilian casualties are down. A significant number of conflict-related detainees have been released from both sides of the contact line. Ukraine has commenced its term on the Human Rights Council, and the election campaign season will soon be upon us. Let us build on this momentum to end hostilities, end impunity, and foment a strong foundation for the protection and respect of human rights of all people in Ukraine. We call on the government to utilize the information contained in our reports in a constructive manner as a baseline for dialogue and policy making, and to work together with the United Nations, civil society, and the international community to identify and implement concrete actions to improve the human rights situation in Ukraine. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, now you're welcome to ask them in English or in Ukrainian.
Thank you, Telesenko on News Agency. I'd like to ask you in English. I just want to clarify figures. You provided us the amount of casualties since the middle of November to the middle of February, but I would like to ask you in general, since the beginning of this conflict and hostilities, what are the figures of those who injured and those who killed? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. So our estimates of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, for the total number of civilians killed during the entire conflict period is to be over 3,000. And that also includes the 298 who were killed on board the flight MH17 on the 17th of July 2014. And the number of conflict-related civilian injuries is estimated between 7,000 and 9,000.
Thank you, Ms. Frazer. If there is no more questions, thank you, and let's finish.
What about the violation of the rights of Ukrainian citizens as to right to see the punishment for those who violate our rights to see punishment for criminals within Ukraine? My idea that many criminals and violators of the human and political rights are not punished in this country, though they were under the so-called judicial procedure. Thank you.
So, as I was saying, a key and core component of the work that we do in supporting the government to implement its human rights obligations is to, for the aim to see that there is accountability for actions that are undertaken that result in crimes and human rights violations. So that is to ensure that there are prompt and effective investigations, that perpetrators are brought to account, that are made responsible for their actions, and that there is justice for victims. So it's a core part of our work, and it's a call that we are making to the authorities, the state authorities of Ukraine, in order to ensure greater human rights protection for those who live in its territory.
Колеги, чи є ще запитання?
Will there be any other questions, dear colleagues? Well, if there aren't any, we will then conclude.